My name is Suzanne Oosterwijk. I'm from the Regional and Information and Outreach branch with UNODA in New York, and I have the honor of moderating this webinar here today. Last Sunday, the 24th of May, we celebrated the 2-year anniversary of the United Nations Secretary General's Agenda for Disarmament. And we thought it would be fitting to dedicate a session to evaluate how it has progressed over the last 2 years. The agenda is an initiative that was drafted against the backdrop of an increasingly strained global security environment, where disarmament commitments have gone unfulfilled, regional tensions grow, and emerging technologies pose new risks to the collective security system. And the agenda aims at reviving serious multilateral dialogue and bringing disarmament and non-proliferation back to the center of the work of the United Nations. It is an initiative that inspires to achieve concrete progress on issues related to disarmament, and it outlines practical measures across the range of disarmament issues, including weapons of mass destruction, conventional arms, and new weapon technologies. And it further seeks to generate fresh perspectives, explore areas for dialogue, strengthen the participation of women and youth, and establish new partnerships and greater collaboration around its 4 pillars, which are disarmament to save humanity, disarmament that saves lives, disarmament for future generations, and strengthening partnerships for disarmament. And we are very pleased that so many of you have joined in for this webinar and this interactive conversation that will ensue about the achievements of the agenda in the past 2 years. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the participants of the current session of the joint ODA-OSCE Scholarship for Peace and Security 2020. Because of the current conditions with the COVID-19 pandemic, this course has been limited to an online part running over a period of 8 weeks. However, once circumstances permit, it will be followed by an in-person training in Vienna for 50 out of the 152 participants. In addition, I would like to welcome alumni of past sessions of the program who have also been invited to join this webinar, as well as a select number of professionals from different organizations and civil society. And finally, we have the immense pleasure to be joined by the permanent representatives of a select numbers of missions in Vienna. As I said, this webinar aims at exploring the achievements of the first 2 years since the launch of the Agenda for Disarmament, Securing Our Common Future. And to start off, we will hear from representatives of champion and supporter states, from UN entities, and from a youth representative, who will each share their viewpoint and experience with the agenda. And amongst others, some issues that might come up in their remarks are: how has the agenda impacted the conversation on issues related to disarmament? How does the disarmament agenda perform in opening up to audiences that perhaps previously have not been part of discussions related to disarmament and arms control? And what are the biggest challenges in the area of disarmament? And of course, importantly, how can we overcome them? After we hear from our distinguished speakers, we will then virtually open the floor up for any questions and comments and engage in an online conversation. Before giving the word to our speakers and starting the procedures, I would like to reiterate the ground rules for this event, which has also been posted in the chat on the side of this of the video. And to begin with, everybody is kindly requested to mute their microphones. When you wish to take the floor after the presentations have finished and ask your questions, please do so by posting the questions in the chat function. We make an exception to this rule for ambassadors from permanent missions who may wish to take the floor after the presentations have finished and verbally deliver comments or make remarks. Except for the panelists and the participating ambassadors that wish to take the floor, we kindly also ask that participants turn off their video in order to save bandwidth. And finally, like I said, the interactive discussions will be conducted via the chat function on Teams. The chat will be monitored by the webinar organizers, and they will filter and cluster participant questions, which I will then put to the relevant panelists. So when posting your questions, kindly indicate who you would like to have your question answered. Well, after these procedural remarks, I would now like to extend a very warm welcome and gratitude to the speakers who we have here with us today. The opening remarks today will be delivered by Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. She will then be followed by Ms. Renato Duan, the Director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Thirdly, you will hear from His Excellency Ambassador Hainochi from Austria, one of the so-called champion states of the agenda. And finally, Ms. Lena Strauss, as youth representative, will make a statement. Well, I'm pleased to give the floor at this time to the High Representative for her introduction. Undersecretary General Nakamitsu has many years of experience both within and outside the United Nations system and has held various functions within, amongst others, the Office for the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees and the United Nations Department for Peacekeeping Operations. Ms. Nakamitsu served as Assistant Administrator of the Crisis Response Unit at the United Nations Development Programme before she assumed her position as Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs on the 1st of May 2017. Undersecretary General Nakamitsu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and good morning and good afternoon to all the participants who are connected from around the world, and welcome to this webinar, which is a very important activity that we organize through our Vienna office. Now, it's very nice to see my friends and colleagues and comrades in disarmament cause. My role this morning is to basically give a very quick overview of what the agenda is, but I thought it would be interesting to look at this in the context, obviously, of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then my dear colleague Renata will be also running through where we are in terms of the implementations. Rest assured that we have not actually stopped working for disarmament. Even during the pandemic, we are very busy pursuing the cause of disarmament. We just do it in a different way, not through a physical meeting and conversations, but means like this one through the virtual means. Now, the Secretary General launched his agenda for disarmament, which is called, entitled Securing Our Common Future, in Geneva on 24th of May in 2018. You know, we all know that his agenda is very comprehensive, but not exhaustive, of course. It has 40 actions with focus foremost on very practical measures which we can actually implement. And the whole agenda is structured in such a way that it will be also supporting member states' responsibilities in terms of their disarmament efforts. Someone has a microphone on. I hear a background noise. Could everyone mute the microphone? Thank you. Yes. Now, I think the COVID-19 crisis really demonstrated how fragile our world is indeed. You know, many of the issues and challenges that we see in the disarmament and arms control area were already there before the COVID-19 crisis. But this pandemic has really highlighted how fragile our world is. In the disarmament field, the Secretary General, in fact, chose that the time is actually now that we need to put disarmament arms control at the center of security, our security discourse, precisely because the world is increasingly demonstrating its division, its heightened tension. And that really is a very important reminder why disarmament is both indispensable and also as a security tool, I would say, underutilized. We could actually use disarmament and arms control instruments much more. so that we can make the world a little bit more of a stable and secure place. Now, in terms of a summary of major pillars, I know that all the participants in this webinar, they have read the agenda and their updates, so I will go very quickly. The first pillar, of course, is disarmament to save humanity, which addresses weapons of mass destruction. Now, the international arms control architecture, as I mentioned already, had already been demonstrating the signs of erosion, and also the world is showing tensions amongst major powers. And those major powers also happen to be nuclear weapon states as well. Obviously, what we are trying to do under the agenda implementation was structured in such a way that it will be supportive to states parties' efforts in the context of NPT review conference, which was, of course, unfortunately postponed because of the COVID pandemic. Now, in nuclear weapons field, we really need to try and focus on supporting practical measures so that we can build, for example, in the context of NPT review conference, we can build on what it is as a common ground between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, and try to have a good results in the 10th review conference. What are some of the practical measures that we try to implement? For example, risk reduction measures. What are the practical measures to reduce risks of nuclear detonation? And how can we potentially really return to a path of substantive dialogue between those major powers? We hope to build on our efforts, and dialogue, I think, is probably one of the key elements in the deterioration of the current atmosphere. In the nuclear field, we would very much like to have renewed commitment to nuclear weapons non-use. And also we would like nuclear weapon states to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their security doctrines. We would like them to reduce their operational readiness and constrain the developments, of course, of new types of nuclear weapons. They are, as you know, all investing tremendous amount of money in the modernization of nuclear weapons, etc. It will also be really useful if transparency of their nuclear weapons programs can be increased, so that trust and confidence will increase as a result of this. So those are some of the efforts that we are doing under the agenda implementation. And as you can see, this will really feed into, hopefully, the efforts of the states parties that they are continuing to make, by the way, through visual means for the NPT review conference. And other weapons of mass destruction, of course, for example, biological weapons that do not really have implementation institution. We would very much like to strengthen those institutions and capacities to prevent any use of nuclear weapons, etc. One, I think, that is very important in this sphere is issues related to new destabilizers strategic weapons. We really want to facilitate progress on preventing new arms race dynamics in outer space, for example. We are also trying to participate in discussions related to hypersonic weapon systems, and for that we think we made a good contribution through the study that we have jointly conducted with UNITIR. So these are some of the efforts that we have been making under the Disarmament to Save Humanity, the first pillar. Now, the second pillar of the disarmament agenda is also deeply related to the current COVID-19 crisis. I hope you have all heard of the Secretary General's call for global ceasefire. If you recall, there are, the weapons, small arms and light weapons, IEDs, and explosive weapons being used in populated areas. Those are the weapon systems, categories of weapon that are continuing to kill thousands of people. And as I'm sure you will all agree, I think the human community now really needs to focus on our fight against the COVID-19 virus. And therefore, the disarmament community putting our heads together, efforts together to try and really reduce the impact of those small arms, light weapons, explosive weapons, IEDs, etc., be placed under control will contribute to global ceasefire call, and therefore us also collectively facing what we really need to be facing together, which is the pandemic issue. This also links very well with increasing, I would say, incredible increase in military budget, for example. Can you imagine all these financial resources be, in fact, spent on countering the pandemic, but also post-pandemic era, economic and social recovery, etc. That will just be a right thing to do. So we are doing a lot of very practical work, again, within the UN system and then beyond, so that we'll be able to make some achievements in this area. I hope you have seen the op-ed piece that we jointly published together with Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and ICRC yesterday on the explosive weapons issues. Those are some of the very practical efforts that we're continuing in the second pillar implementation. Now, disarmament for future generations is also extremely relevant to the COVID-19. You can imagine how important it is to really make sure that those new technologies, whether that is cyber technologies or AI, those are, as we speak, transforming our lives. In the pandemic, one of the reasons why we can remain connected and have this kind of conversations and continuing our work or education is thanks to those digital technologies. But at the same time, I can put to you an incredible statistics data. Ever since the COVID-19 pandemic has started, there have been more than 600% increase in malicious emails. And those data really expose pre-existing vulnerabilities. This is the negative side of the technology by those malicious actors. And that's exactly why we felt very important to include this third pillar, disarmament for future generations, in order for us to maximize the benefits from those new technologies and making sure that we mitigate and minimize the potential of misuse of those technologies. So we are doing, for example, a lot of understanding and awareness raising work together with, I must say, very encouragingly, people coming from the industry, science and technology, academia as well. And they are, in fact, the ones who really want to work with the United Nations to making sure that the negative side of technologies will be placed under control. In the AI field, the lethal autonomous weapon systems, the very important and again, very practical work of, for example, sharing experiences and outcomes of new weapon reviews. which is conducted by states. Those are some of the practical work that we are doing together with our partners, most importantly, of course, the supporters and champions of um, agenda implementation. Now, I know there are a lot of people online participating from training courses, and that is really encouraging for us. The fourth pillar of the disarmament agenda is partnership for disarmament. And I repeat this story actually. When launch of the agenda was organized, the Secretary General himself was extremely keen to go outside of the UN conference rooms. And I'm quoting him. He said, I want to do this launch at a university. I want to talk to young people, because if we are really serious about disarmament, we need to work with people who are not in the UN conference rooms in a normal settings. We need to understand what the young people are thinking. And that's exactly why we value this kind of opportunities of webinar, talking to people who are interested in disarmament, who want to become a disarmament experts and activists in the future. The partnership section also addresses very importantly how we should work with regional organizations, how we should make sure that women are participating and represented in all decision-making processes related to disarmament. Women have always been very important advocates of disarmament, but disproportionately they were not part of the decision-making and negotiation processes of many of the important disarmament agreements. So we need to change that, and we are doing, again, a very important and very practical work with many of our partners in this regard. And civil society actors are also key allies. So we want to reinvigorate our partnership with those various people and institutions in the implementation phase. Now, in closing, just where are we in terms of very broadly current status of implementation? We are tracking the status of implementation of 123 activities under the implementation. As I said, there are 40 actions included. And they are also, I didn't mention this, I should have probably. We have 16 unique activities that are related to SDGs. I think one of the key conceptual achievements, if you will, of the agenda is that we placed it very squarely within the SDGs. Implementing disarmament will be an important help for us to implement the SDGs as well. So again, during the course of the pandemic, we have been able to find new ways to be connected and continue the work of the implementation of the agenda. And I think one of the most encouraging issues related to the status of implementation is that nearly 3/4, 28 out of 40 that is, of actions under the implementation plan, we see a significant updates since the launch 2 years ago. Now, my final word, of course, is my sincere thanks and how important it is for all of us to work with the 24 so far states of supporters and champions from both Global South and Global North, and of course, the European Union. They are, in fact, a key implementers, if you will. Disarmament is a very interesting area in that not one single actor alone will be able to achieve significant outcome. The work that we do would really need to be done in a very strong partnership, and supporters and champions of implementation of the agenda for disarmament indeed is the most important partners that we have achieved. And that, I think, it alone is a very encouraging thing that we are seeing in front of us. So you can see that I try to be always very positive. I look at the positive side of it, despite the fact that we are collectively in a very difficult situation, obviously, from the pandemic. I think this pandemic has really teaching us a lesson that we can only address very difficult issues through solidarity, unity, humility. And I think it is also telling us that we really need to put human beings at the center of our security discourse. And that's exactly what we have tried to do, what we're still trying to do through the agenda for disarmament. I thank you. I probably spoke a little bit too long, but I thank you for this opportunity. And I'm very keen to listen to, or actually read through the chat room, what are the issues that are important to all these participants that are being connected through this virtual means. Thank you. Over to you, Suzanne.
I thank the High Representative for her opening remarks and providing an insightful and indeed positive overview of the efforts that have begun and are underway in the implementation of the agenda to date, as well as underlying the urgency for disarmament matters, especially in these times of unprecedented global health crisis. And I am sure there will be many questions that follow the High Representative's presentations, which we will happily take after we finish hearing from all our speakers. The next speaker with us today is Ms. Renato Duan, who will go into more detail as to the implementation of the agenda across various UN entities. Ms. Duan is the director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva. And prior to joining UNIDIR in 2018, she worked on peace and security issues and complex emergencies at UN headquarters and in Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Mali, and Syria. And prior, Ms. Duan was head of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's program on armed conflict and conflict management, and deputy director of the East-West Institute's European Security Program in Budapest. Ms. Duan, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. Good afternoon to everyone in Vienna. Hello to everyone in New York, Geneva, and abroad. Thanks very much for bringing us together. It's a good occasion, 2 years in on the SG's agenda, to look at what's happening, but it's also a great opportunity to connect with the Vienna, New York, Geneva community. We don't always talk as much as we used to, and perhaps one of the unforeseen benefits of COVID is these opportunities for more sustained dialogue. Izumi gave a very comprehensive outline of the agenda and some of the progress and the actions that have taken place to date. So I won't go into that too much, and I also want to leave plenty of opportunity for discussion. So I'm going to just touch on 4 points that I think are worth us bearing in mind about the agenda, and then I'm going to touch on just some of the actions where a little bit of progress might be happening. Now, you might be asking, where does UNIDIR fit in this and the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research? We are a partner, as with many other UN entities and other entities, in this agenda for disarmament and in the efforts to advance it. UNIDIR leads on 10 of the 40 actions and is involved in another 20. So it's something that is very close to our hearts and has really shaped how we go forward with the agenda in our work and in our research. Let me just say, highlight 4 points. Izumi's touched on some of them, but I maybe echo and add on it. The first one is the timing of the SG's agenda. And I think Izumi, as always, is much more diplomatic than I am. But I think the key point that we want to make is the SG's agenda is really making the key point that disarmament is not a tool for good times. And we're hearing time and time now, much more frequently, that the security environment does not permit progress on key arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament initiatives. What I think the SG's agenda really is postulating is an alternative position that says precisely when the environment is as unpredictable, as difficult, as strained, that's the time when we need arrangements to regulate our actions, to regulate our weapons, to regulate our ways of warfare, so that we can manage these crises and therefore facilitate ways to build trust, build cooperation, and build dialogue. So disarmament is a tool for the bad times just as it is a tool for the good times. And I think that's a really important moment where we are. That's also a very relevant moment for where we are in COVID. As Izumi said, in a way, disarmament is even more to the fore now, as we see in a COVID crisis, when we think about biological weapons implementation, convention implementation, and how we might need to think about compliance and enforcement of treaties, regulations, cooperation. We really see some important lessons that we can think about, and that will become important for the Biological Weapons Convention Review Conference in 2021. The second point that I think was really significant in the SG's agenda is this call to bring disarmament back to the center of the UN. And that's important when we celebrate the UN at 75. The UN's first General Assembly resolution centered around nuclear weapons. It was the call, the coming together of so many nations in the ruins of World War II was a reflection of the horrors and the ravages of war and the need to prevent future generations from the scourge of war. So at the heart of the drive for the United Nations is the need to prevent conflict between nations and the idea of regulating, managing, and preventing the use of these horrific weapons that we have developed. And in particular, nuclear weapons was at the heart of that UN at 75. So in a year when we mark the 75 years of this organization, the idea that disarmament needs to be part of all the three pillars of the UN, the peace and security pillar, the human rights pillar, and the sustainable development pillar, I think, is very much a key message of the Secretary General's agenda. I think we've made quite a bit of progress over the past 2 years in articulating the links between disarmament and sustainable development across all the sustainable development goals, and not just goal 16, peaceful and just and secure institutions. But I think we perhaps also want to reinforce ourselves that disarmament is also a key tool in the efforts for to maintain peace and international peace and security, and to advance the human rights of people around the world. So I think that's a key message. The third point I would say, and that's perhaps the area that we've been exploring within the UN, as Secretary General lists a whole set of new actors and existing actors that need to work together to make disarmament effective. So the idea that somehow disarmament is a small, limited, highly technical, highly specialist enterprise undertaken by a specific set of actors, the Secretary General's agenda throws that wide open and calls for the need for development actors, for gender advocates, for civil society actors, for the private sector, for many UN actors working more together to really have impact in addressing some of the problems of weapons and their regulation and governance. And I think that's been one of the areas where we've seen a lot of progress, and I'll flag a few points. The fourth point that I would just flag is, I think the Secretary's agenda for disarmament is also honest that disarmament itself needs to change and adapt to new technologies, to new issues and threats, to new actors in power, some of them state actors, some of them non-state actors. And that some of the frameworks and the tools and the approaches that we have that have been at the center of disarmament efforts over decades need to be expanded and rethought. An example of that is his call to bring non-state actors into discussions around new technologies, both civil society, but also the private sector and technical expertise. Another example of that is his recognition that we need to have much more engagement on nuclear issues and nuclear disarmament issues for all the member states engaged, and that it's not the purview of nuclear weapon states only, or indeed any particular regional or other grouping. So I think it's a call to say that disarmament also needs to look at how we adapt, how we change, and how we navigate those processes. So if I look at some of the areas, I will say, and I think Izumi alluded to this, that it's a difficult environment in which to advance new initiatives. And it's even as we see the challenges with maintaining existing frameworks and dialogue. But I'll take one example from each of the 4 chapters that Izumi outlined as an example of where progress is possible and some of the thoughts that we might want to think about what works and how can we advance some concrete progress in these elements. I will also preface, and Izumi, I think, hinted at this, that the range of actions, it is a menu of options. It is not a diktat that says every one of these 40 actions needs to be implemented and all at the same time. The Secretary General is offering to the global community, particularly member states, but not just member states, here are the range of actions that we think need to happen and how we can advance them. So maybe just taking the chapter in the first chapter on that addresses WMD threats, and if we look at saving humanity, I think COVID has reinforced the threat, the very real threat that existential challenges causes us existential threats. And also what I think COVID has done has shown us that we need to pay more attention to addressing low risk, high impact events. COVID, a pandemic, it might be not something that happens regularly or is a threat regularly, but when it does happen, it has such significant impact and causes that we need to address. And nuclear detonation is a similar, potentially lower risk, but with huge impact. And how we think about moving forward in that is really a critical requirement for us today. If you look at the area of nuclear risk reduction, Izumi mentioned this as an area of work that was highlighted by the Secretary General. And in the 2 years that have followed the Secretary General's agenda, you really have seen the emergence of a very active dialogue around ways to reduce the risk of use of nuclear weapons. You've seen UNIDIR is identified as one of the lead actors in this area, and we have undertaken a series of studies that is attempting to try first to find a framework of analysis on what constitutes a nuclear risk or risk of use, so that we can even begin to facilitate the conversation between member states on coming to terms with discussing risk. Previously, it's been very contentious because one person's risk is another person's security. So how to find even a framework for dialogue. We've set that in motion. And then we've undertaken a series of studies saying what might be specific risk reduction measures that could be taken in various regions and in various adversarial environments that could be practically to help address threats in the near term. What are those threats and then how we can identify them. And what we're now pursuing and working is looking at what is the most risk that we have today, which is the escalation pathway, the risk of accidental use through miscalculation or through escalation of conventional conflict. And this is recognized by a broad range of experts as possibly the most significant area of risk and one that we are exploring. I think you've seen the start of this dialogue, difficult, contentious though it is, amongst member states. It's come up very much, and it's now a dominant theme in the discussions around the NPT review conference. It's been at the heart of the initiative by a group of non-nuclear weapon states, championed by Sweden and then Germany, the so-called Stockholm Initiative. It's also been used, it's come up, and it's one of the working group themes in the CEND initiative, the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, that has been spearheaded by the United States. And then finally, you're seeing now the P5, in their own dialogue, recognize the need to address nuclear risk reduction. So that's, I think, an area of something that seemed 2 years ago a very controversial theme and idea, but we're now seeing it come into the bloodstream in discussions and in practices amongst member states. There's still a way to go. What does that tell us about how we can work together with the agenda? It seems to me that 3 elements. The first is that we need creative ideas and research thinking, and that's the role of entities like UNIDIR, but not only UNIDIR, many excellent think tanks around the world working on these issues and advocacy actors. So we need the ideas. But 2, we need the dialogues, and therefore the role of champions and those member states that select to support work in this area, to engage in discussions, to facilitate discussions in different groupings is really critical. And third, there isn't the need for any single dialogue. Rather, we need a multiple sets of ongoing dialogues. And sometimes that's challenging for us in our hierarchical UN world and the way we'd like to do things. But there is a value, and there's a need for the nuclear weapon states to discuss amongst themselves. There's a need for regional dialogues. There is a need for global multilateral dialogues. So we see nuclear risk reduction as a case in point of where you have ongoing parallel dialogues. And that may not be a bad thing, particularly in this current moment. The second area I will just flag is in the conventional arms space, the saving humanity, which we know is an area that the Secretary General feels very active and strong on, in part because I think it's an area where he feels he can take some concrete actions in the UN system. I was tempted to talk about explosive weapons in populated areas and the work in that respect, but knowing that Thomas is on the agenda and his considerable expertise and leadership in that area, I'll instead just flag another area where I think there has been some good progress happening. And that's in the UN coming together around a specific issue. And for example, IEDs, improvised explosive devices, is one such area. You've seen partly for a while a sense of, well, where does this sit, IEDs? It's not quite mines, it's not quite belonging to peacekeeping, it's not quite a certain area. And a sense of no one actor leading and championing this within the UN system. Now, as a result, partly of the agenda, it's proved huge impetus for the establishment of a task force, a UN system-wide task force on IEDs. You have the development led by UNMAS. You have a coming together of the humanitarian, the peace operations actors, the disarmament actors together to work on the issue of what does this mean in areas. And you have the development of concrete models and tools working with countries, of which we have had some role in working on the development of self-assessment tools for countries to be able to use in assessing their own capacities. I'll also touch on one more that I personally am very committed to, which is how do we mainstream conventional arms risks and assessments into the way we do prevention and peace building thinking and action in the field? Because ultimately, the issue of small arms and light weapons is an issue of who dies and who lives, and regular civilians in communities and affected often by conflict and by also fragility of wide variation. So the idea of bringing a conventional arms control tool, lens, awareness into our thinking and actions on prevention is something that is giving new drive to the Secretary General's commitment on prevention, but also putting practical application to conventional arms. And I'll just use a practice in point. The UN's engagement in Libya, would it have looked different if we had a conventional arms risk assessment undertaken and a significant assessment of the risks, the presence, what weapons we were talking about and where in the context of the conflict in Libya? So can we learn from that and can we adapt as we go? And that's an exercise that we're facilitating with a community of practice, wide discussion. And I must say, it's really stimulating to see these people from all over the world on different field missions, working in different areas and parts of the UN, whether from the development, from the recovery, from the humanitarian, from the arms control, in a very concrete way to look at that practice. On the third chapter, the security and technology, what I perhaps would really want to signal are two initiatives, and they're very much related to this point about disarmament also needs to adapt and change, which is one of the calls of the Secretary General. You have first a whole new emphasis on multi-stakeholder dialogue around, in particular, digital technology, and the Secretary General's panel on digital cooperation was one such example, but also in the context of cybersecurity and the implementation of norms around responsible behaviors and responsible state behavior in cyberspace. There, I think we're seeing a considerable amount of engagement, and one of the high points for me has been to see that in the two UN processes underway on cyber issues, the group of governmental experts and the open-ended working group, both looking on similar areas of how do we look at guidance, principles, norms, and practices on cyber responsible behavior by states on cyberspace. You're seeing communities and member states willing to hear and willing to engage with the private sector, with the expert sector, with civil society actors. Still a way to go, but much more than we've had before. And a good example of that is just the AREA formula discussion last week that is organized by Estonia and the Security Council. So that's an example of how ideas can mature and space can be found for new actors. The fourth and final section on partnerships, I'm going to highlight gender in particular. And I think we really have seen a revolution in the context of the SG's agenda on the whole role of women in disarmament. Disarmament has lagged in terms of women's participation, women's diplomatic and advocacy participation in it. UNIDIR published a significant study, still behind the curve, in 2019 that outlined that compared to other sorts of processes, other sorts of committees in the UN, the disarmament community is far behind at about 30% of women's participation. Since then, we've seen a large mobilization. We've seen gender nuclear policy groups starting in different parts of the world. We have a group in Vienna of the Disarmament Impact Group. UNIDIR has set up a Disarmament Impact Group together with our colleagues in Namibia, Canada, Ireland, Philippines. That a similar chapter is being set up in The Hague, and we're seeing a real sense of engagement on what does it mean to have women. What I'm most encouraged in that area is that we're moving beyond just a question of participation, important though that is. We're beginning to say, what does a gender perspective in arms control mean? What questions do we ask differently? What policy choices do we make differently? How do we think about nuclear policy or small arms and light weapons policy differently when we think about women in the room? And that's one of the more exciting and engaging space that also brings together communities that weren't always talking together, which is particularly the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which celebrates 20 years this year, and the arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament community. So I'm going to end by saying that I think there's much work to be done, but I think we're seeing from those 4 examples that I've tried to raise, when you get a varied, diverse group committed to an issue and prepared to put ideas, but in particular, new ways of dialogue, new types of activity, new forms of engagement, you're seeing that we can, even in these very difficult times, make progress. And I hope, therefore, that we can be inspired by some of the actions that we can take forward in our post-COVID age, or COVID age for quite some time to come. Thanks very much, Suzanne.
Thank you very much to the director of UNIDIR for presenting us with her key points and very practical examples that illustrate both the opportunities as well as the challenges in the international security context that the agenda lays bare. And I think her remarks offer plenty of food for thought to inspire our discussion and dialogue here today about how to move disarmament forward in the 21st century. And on that note, before I hand it over to our next speaker, this is a friendly reminder for all participants. Feel free at this stage to post any questions or comments that you might already have for our speakers in the chat. We will address these questions after we hear from all 4 of our speakers, but I can imagine that these presentations have already brought up a lot of questions that you would like to touch upon. So feel free at this stage to already put forward your questions in the chat function. Well, allow me at this time to turn over to His Excellency Ambassador Heinocci of Austria, one of the champions of the agenda for disarmament. Ambassador Heinocci is the current Director for Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in the Austrian Federal Ministry for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs. And from 2013 to 2017, he served as permanent representative of Austria to the United Nations Office at Geneva. And over the years, he has been closely involved in several multilateral humanitarian disarmament processes, including in the negotiations of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Ambassador, you have the floor. Ambassador, you are still muted. You may wish to unmute your microphone. If you put your mouse over the screen, there is a bar that comes up with a microphone, a video camera.
Okay, is it working?
This is perfect.
Sorry. Well, good afternoon. It's very nice to see you, Suzanne, Itsumi, and Renata. And I see at least the initials of the many participants in this webinar. I only can agree with Izumi. I think the agenda is very important. I mean, when you want to do something, you have to have an agenda, and then you have to identify clear actions. And I really like the coinage disarmament that saves lives, because that's really what it's about to do. I think it's also valid, of course, for weapons of mass destruction. There's always this link up to the individual human being. There's no national security that is not at the same time, of course, also a human security, because it's about people. A nation consists of people. And this becomes, of course, very clear when we come to the issue protecting civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. What we have seen over the last years, decades, is that the nature of armed conflict has changed. 200 years ago, you were fighting outside the cities, in Waterloo or somewhere else. And of course, civilians always experienced harm, but not at this extent. Today, all the major armed conflicts like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and also in Africa, all these conflicts, they are predominantly fought in populated areas. That means cities, villages, accumulation of civilians. And it's really staggering when you take the figures. When explosive weapons are used in populated areas, 90% of those who get killed are civilians. And that, of course, must ring an alarm bell, because under the principles of international humanitarian law, there's this principle of distinction. That means you have, whatever you do, you have to make the distinction between civilians and armed fighters, and all the other principles. So it is particularly true when these explosive weapons have a wide area effect. So what are explosive weapons? All arms that are based on explosion. It can be air bombing, it can be shelling. So they are very normal arms that are frequently used. And there's no attempt or even thought to ban these weapons. That's not the idea. It's just when you use these weapons, you have to use them in a way that are not violating international humanitarian law. And what we see is that in so many conflicts, international humanitarian law is violated in that regard. And the effects, of course, they are both direct and indirect. So people get killed, clearly. Just imagine someone drops air bombs over a market, because there might be really a legitimate target there. Let's say a terrorist is there, but you shouldn't hit this target when it's in a market where so many civilians are and would get killed. You have also then people are dying, or they get hurt. You have the problem of disablement, very much so also psychological effect. All these interviews with refugees from Syria, for example, show that the psychological effects they are very serious and long-standing. And then you have a number of indirect effects. When you bomb a city, there is no sanitation, no water, no electricity, no healthcare, no jobs, nothing. So even in case you are lucky and your house was not hit, you cannot continue to live there. So you have to back up and move. And that's the number one reason why people have to become displaced. You cannot stay there. There's no basis to live there any longer, no schooling, nothing. And that has a long-term impact, of course. It makes it also so difficult to provide humanitarian assistance, even afterwards to rebuild. So it's not just something that happens in 1 minute, and regrettably, some people are dead. I mean, it can mean that a country is falling back for decades in its development. So the United Nations Secretary General, actually already Ban Ki-moon, was addressing on this issue, and the present one, Antonio Guterres, with his humanitarian background, even more so. These weapons are legitimate. We have everything under international law, but it's not implemented. So what can we do? What should we do? Well, we have to focus on the problem. We have to see that the norms are also implemented. We have to go a little bit deeper than just say they are principles. And therefore, the idea actually of the Secretary General was to elaborate a political declaration on the issue. And I've been very much also personally engaged in this. We set up a cross-sectoral, cross-regional group of interested countries. We organized a number of meetings. So, for example, last October, there was a big international conference on the issue in which 133 countries participated. And that led then to the start of the elaboration of this political declaration, which is led by Ireland. And this is done in consultations. They take place in Geneva. And for the time being, of course, you cannot meet, but it's an urgent issue. So countries can send in their written comments to the now already second Irish draft. The idea is to adopt this political declaration within the next month. We have other similar political declarations, for example, safety of school. And it is working quite well because we cannot expect that everybody is signing up immediately. It's not a thing where all states participate and it's just built on consensus, and therefore you have a very low common denominator. But you try to have as many countries as possible. And the interest is very high in these consultations. More than 100 countries actively participate. And then, of course, what is very important also for us is then the implementation of this political declaration. And there are very concrete points in the draft. I mean, for example, a toolbox of good military practices, because at the end of the day, the purpose of the military doesn't really improve when you make civilians your enemies. We have seen this, for example, in Afghanistan, where rather quickly very good procedures were put in place in order to avoid to kill civilians. So it's both in the spirit of the mission, but certainly it's very necessary to uphold international humanitarian law that the situation will change. This will also take a lot of activities like better data collection. The victim assistance is important in this context. It will need meetings, also, of course, of militaries, that it is better clear to many of the involved parties in conflicts what they really have to do. We have to go beyond just to say here's a principle. No, it's about the implementation. I would like to stop here, and I'm looking for your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hanotchi, for your remarks and for highlighting the ongoing process to address the impact of explosive weapons in populated areas, which, as you have highlighted, have a devastating impact on civilians and civilian objects, and is an important part of the pillar on disarmament that saves lives. I would now like to invite Ms. Lena Strauss as youth representative to make a brief statement. Ms. Strauss is a political scientist by training with a focus on security and defense issues, and she currently works as an associate at the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. She is also a guest researcher at the Berlin-based think tank German Institute for International and Security Affairs and a project manager at Women in International Security Germany. Last year, she was awarded the UNODA OSCE Scholarship for Peace and Security, which has reinforced her plans on pursuing a PhD on interorganizational cooperation in disarmament affairs. Ms. Lena Strauss, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me? Just brief.
We hear you loud and clear.
Perfect, that's great. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to see that so many people have joined this webinar today. First of all, let me congratulate this year's scholarship recipients. Congratulations, and I hope you enjoy the program. It's a really fantastic opportunity. Just as an awardee of or recipient of the scholarship last year, I just want to draw your attention and focus on a few issues concerning education. And Ms. Duan, as well as the Undersecretary General Nakamitsu, already said a lot about education and gender equality. I just want to highlight two brief issues on that. First of all, as you probably all know, the SDG goal 4 on education, as well as 5, are very significant to this cause, as well as the third pillar of the Secretary General's agenda on disarmament. So education and future generations, these are the keys. And all of you ladies and young men from the scholarship, this year's scholarship, you are the affected generation. We are the affected generation. And in order to change the future, we need to have more education. We need to know about the past and the present. We need to have the understanding of the failures of the past, of all those treaties and regimes which are currently being dismantled in order to change the future. So we need to know about the new technologies. Maybe some of them are not so new to our generation. And to change this, we need education and knowledge, of course, and also the inclusivity, meaning everybody should be engaged. Now, we need both of those issues that I just mentioned to make things better. So we need not only to rethink, but also to re-engage and to rebuild the current disarmament infrastructure, which is currently under threat. So connect your passion and your education you gain through this course, but also at university, at other summer schools, webinars, whatever you wish to take part in, or whatever you take part in. Use that. Find your passion, find what sparks your interest, whatever topic that may be. Biological weapons, chemical, whatever it is on the disarmament agenda that you like to work on. Choose it and work on it. Engage with people, engage with knowledge, and find your passion there on a specific issue. And then you can be the change. You can get involved on the policy side. You can also get engaged in NGO advocacy, research, diplomacy, whatever it is. Choose it and be engaged and change it, because we're gonna be the ones who have to deal in the future with all those regimes, treaties, and that stuff which are falling apart at the moment. So get engaged. It's fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. Get engaged, it's fun. I think that is a great motto for this webinar. And I thank you for your thoughtful remarks, focusing on inclusivity and education, which are indeed vital elements to strengthen the current disarmament environment. And I think her passionate call for engagement is already well reflected in the chat function, where I see lots of questions coming up, which we will be putting to our panelists shortly. At this point, before opening up discussions for those questions from the participants, I would like to invite any permanent representative of the Vienna-based missions that have joined here today and who would like to speak to please kindly take the floor. At this stage, I see no movement yet on the screen. Was Her Excellency Ms. Lenehel Aldit, would you like to make a few comments? As I know that you are with us here today. As I don't see her coming up the screen yet, I think we can now move on to the questions from the audience. And of course, we would like to invite the ambassador at any point to chip in with her remarks or comments that she would like to introduce to the participants and to the panelists. At this stage, we have a couple of questions that we would like to put forward. One of the questions that was asked is a question addressed at the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. So I would like to put this question to the Under Secretary General, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu. How does UNODA plan to integrate the parliamentary role in the continued process of agenda implementation? Ms. Nakamitsu?
Yes, thank you very much for that very important question. There are actually several things that we are already doing. You know, one of the things that immediately after the, in fact, TPNW was adopted, this is a treaty for prohibition of nuclear weapons, we started to have a much sort of increased number of parliamentarians individually, but also as, for example, Committee on Defense or Committee on Foreign Policy. So, you know, individually or as a group have started to contact us, wanted to have discussions and briefings on how things are when it comes to nuclear disarmament. And that was all part of their own efforts to increase their engagements on those issues. And we very much welcome those moves by parliamentarians or parliaments themselves. And so we are putting a lot of priority in terms of reacting to positively to that sort of request. I have also addressed several parliaments on invitation from them to give briefing on the status of disarmament, arms control in general. So I would say that there is much more increased interest from the parliaments, and we welcome that, and we very much would like to work with parliaments around the world on those issues. The second is also, you know, there are groups like, for example, PGA, Parliamentarians for Global Action. There is also, what was the name of it? The Interparliamentary Union, IPU, I think is the name of it. There are those global parliaments and parliamentarians organizations that are keen to work on disarmament issues. And that's also a demonstration of, if I could put it this way, sort of deteriorated international security situations, you know, sort of detected by parliamentarians and parliaments themselves, and therefore putting those issues back on their priority agenda. So we are definitely taking advantage of those international organizations, of those people in parliaments, and that's another part of the very important partnership that we would like to very much further strengthen. Thank you for asking this question. I think it's a very key part of it. After all, it is the legislature, that have a enormous power entrusted upon them in the domestic political scenes, and themselves actually taking on those issues will start to change the policies of various countries, and that's exactly what we want to see as a movement, if you will.
Thank you, Ms. Nakamitsu. And perhaps we can continue a little bit looking at the various partnerships that are needed in disarmament and in implementing the agenda for disarmament. One question that came in is addressed to Ms. Duan, who spoke about engaging private sector entities into disarmament, and the agenda for disarmament provides that opportunity. What are your thoughts on tangible actions to engage the private sector more on weapons of mass destruction and conventional arms disarmament initiative, given that businesses are some of the biggest benefactors of peace? Is taking on private sector sponsors of the agenda implementation actions a possibility for the UN? Ms. Duan?
Thank you for that question. And it's true that indeed the agenda for disarmament talks about the private sector, primarily in the context of security and technology, the SecTech disarmament for future generations. But I guess I would argue 2 points. First is, in a way, the private sector has always been involved in arms control issues because it constitutes a large part of the industry around arms control and buying. And so weapons manufacturing, nuclear supplies, security has always been a large component and involved a discussion with the private sector. And examples of that, we see a lot that the IAEA in Vienna does around questions of nuclear safety. You've seen a lot of discussions also around issues about preventing the proliferation of nuclear material to non-state actors, groups around those discussions and summits led under the Obama administration. That involved a lot of discussions with private sector and their actions in supporting the preventing nuclear material falling into the hands of actors, non-proliferation. You see sanctions and measures around established by the Security Council are open to are requirements for the private sector. And in the context of conventional arms, you're seeing a lot of discussions around the Arms Trade Treaty, established in 2015 around regulation of arms materials. And so there you see an active and ongoing debate with the private sector about what the requirements they're required to do to prevent diversion and to think about human rights risks and controls, including the risks of gender-based violence that could be used. And that is now part of an international legal instrument that the private sector is responsible for following and must uphold. I would just frame two sort of, I think, new challenges or two challenges that we might want to think about. The first is dual use technologies and dual use. So it's one thing to have a formal discussion with arms manufacturers and ammunition manufacturers. It's another thing to have a discussion with the chemical companies and industry more broadly about lots of precursor elements that could be used for in the manufacturing of anything from IEDs to and in other risks. And there you see a set of actors becoming involved in a discussion who might not see themselves as having anything to do with the arms control, non-proliferation or disarmament space. Another example of this is in the context of artificial intelligence on autonomous weapon systems and the role of autonomy in new technologies. So that's bringing in technologies that have use, possibly in a military application, but also have non-military or non-weapons applications. And how do we think about their regulation? And then a third example I would give is in the context of space. There's a lot of development in the recent years on space development, the proliferation of satellites, proliferation of new space exploration, including big private sector actors. But it presents challenges because of the framework of many of our governance systems, which are based on state-based dialogues, interactions. But we do have good experience in the Chemical Weapons Convention, in the Biological Weapons Convention, in conventional arms actions of how we can bring in private sector. And so I think there is plenty of precedent on which we can build. There is also the need to explore possibly new forms of dialogue. And that's where we're dealing with in the context of discussions around space safety, just as much as space security, as well as in the context of dual use technologies and how we address them in innovations in cyber and in artificial intelligence. I'll just point out that I would say there's often a perception that somehow the private sector is not so keen on regulation. And that it's governments that seek to regulate and private sector does not. And obviously the private sector is far too complex an area and a field for us to begin to even to make such statements. But I would argue that in some cases, and space is a good example, private sector actors are among those that are the most pushing for rules of the road, pushing for safe space security arrangements, pushing for some forms of dialogues among states so that they can regulate and protect the considerable assets that they've just deployed, that they have deployed in space, and ensure that they're not damaged by debris from the use of anti-satellite testing, that they're not damaged by accident from the lack of monitoring and arrangements in space. So there you're seeing an example of where private sectors are actually driving member states into and being advocates for having rules, what I call rules of the road. So I think it's a complex area in space, but I think we have lots of precedent and lots of different examples on which we can work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata, for providing those insights. There are a couple of questions coming in that address the erosion of the current arms control and disarmament infrastructure, and questions to the panelists about how might we prevent further erosion. And perhaps linking this question also to another question that was put forward, that the agenda sees a clear need for retooling multilateral processes and institutions. And how might we utilize that in order to prevent that erosion from continuing? Is there any of the panelists who would like to provide their thoughts on that question? Perhaps I may give the floor to Ambassador Hanotchi. Ambassador, you are muted.
Is it okay now?
Absolutely, okay. We hear you.
Sorry, it's sometimes a little bit tricky, it takes several attempts. Well, first of all, of course, that's the big issue that is being discussed a lot. As a personal comment, I think erosion is a little bit a strange word to mention what is happening, because erosion, of course, is something that happens due to the forces of nature. And it doesn't seem that what we see a demise of a system of international arms control and disarmament treaties is something that is happening because nature wants it this way. So it is very critical that these agreements that after all limit, for example, nuclear weapons don't fade away, are not terminated in a way that we get into a new arms race without any limit. This would be very bad, I think, both for the security, spending or yeah, somebody is working hard somewhere. Yeah, yeah. There's also this financial element always. I mean, money is finite. You cannot use billions of dollars for building nuclear weapons and doing all the other necessary things. I think the present COVID crisis shows it very clearly. Obviously, there was too much money going into building arms and not enough for having a strong health sector. And it will be interesting now what will happen, because after all this big spending by governments in order to prevent a major economic breakdown, one day these things will have to repay it, and what will be the impact of the arms programs. So I think what we can do, and therefore the NPT review conference will be very important also in that way, is to remind those countries that have concluded these treaties that this was also part of their obligation under the NPT. I mean, you cannot make progress on nuclear disarmament when you at the same time develop new nuclear arms, build more nuclear arms perhaps. So this is totally running against the obligations of the NPT. And I think there was a positive developments like the already mentioned TPNW, because clearly a majority of states does not want to have less limitations for nuclear arms, but wants to have finally, after 50 years, this objective being fulfilled, the total elimination of nuclear weapons, which is something to which the 5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT have subscribed. So it's not something that they would not like to honor. It's more, I think, a matter of speed and where are we going to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for highlighting that erosion is a natural process and that this is by no means such a natural process, and that it can be stopped and reversed if effort is put into that. Thank you very much. We are nearing the end of the time that we have together. There are still many questions that have been asked through the chat. I hope that we can still address at least one of them. A couple of questions that came in, which is very clear in the agenda for disarmament, which is the need for a meaningful participation of women in the field of disarmament, as well as empowering youth to participate in this field. Which is exemplified by the participants that we have here with us today. So I would like to take this opportunity in closing to ask the panelists, and perhaps Ms. Strauss, I can ask you to kick off. What would be your advice to women and youth active in this field, taking forward the important issues of disarmament in the 21st century?
Thank you very much for the question. As I said, I would look at what are you interested, what's your passion, which topic, and then try to engage. Make a decision whether you like to be more on the advocacy side and get engaged in an NGO. There are a lot of NGOs out there, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, whatever topic you're interested in. Or go into research, just pick your passion, try to engage with researchers, but also with diplomats. Go to conferences, also attend webinars. I think linking both education with your passion and try to get an entry in the field. Go apply for internships. just every resource you have out there. Look for a mentor. Just address people. Write them a message via LinkedIn. Just, I'm interested in this. That's my passion. I want to do this. What's your experience? Just go talk to people, and they will help you, because it's a very complicated field, and there's room for young people there. So just go out and figure out what you would like to do and what you're really interested in, and then pursue your passion there.
Thank you very much, and for stressing that there is indeed room for young people to be involved in this field. And perhaps with that, I might give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu for her final thoughts on the issue of women engagement and youth engagement in the field of disarmament.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe I will build on where Ms. Strauss also left. Number one, find something that you are passionate about. You know, in this kind of work, of course, cool heads is very important, but passion also is something that will drive your energy and devotion to the work that you would like to pursue. So finding something that you feel very passionate about, I think, is very important. And then once you've done that, arm yourself with knowledge and experience. Find opportunities where you can deepen your understandings, learn to use your expertise and knowledge in an effective way, communication skill. And then I think it's also very important to be connected with others, be part of a network or networks that you can, you know, organize your passion and thoughts and experience. And that's sort of a network with which you can grow further, and also you can find further opportunities, is throughout your career, I think will be a very important asset that you can have. And then find, you know, motivations and mentors, those who can support you. And I think those support networks will also be very important. And then the most important, I would say, is to believe in yourself, to really believe that you can actually change the world, you can contribute. That sort of a self-confidence. Of course, be humble is is very important, but believe in your ability, your skills, and your potential to contribute will carry many, many years through this. I warn you, it is a difficult field. It's every day, a couple of times every day, I would say, you will feel the frustration. But at the same time, if you have the passion and the belief that you are doing something very important, you don't actually care about those difficulties. You get further motivated, and that's the beauty of being involved in this kind of work. So that's a very concrete advice. I actually live through those almost on a daily basis also. So I hope many of you will join. I think you have already joined this community. So I'm very much looking forward to working very closely with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nakamitsu. I think these encouraging words, even though there is some frustration involved in this field, it is highly important, and we are with a highly motivated community. These will take us forward in the rest of our day. We have come to the end of the time that we have available with each other here today. I would like to extend my gratitude to our distinguished speakers, Undersecretary General Ms. Nakamitsu, Ms. Duan, Ambassador Hanochi, and Ms. Strauss for their very valuable contribution and insights on the achievements of the agenda for disarmament, as well as looking at ways forward. And thank you also to the distinguished ambassadors and representatives from international organizations and civil society who joined us today. And of course, last but not least, thank you to the alumni and the current participants of the ODA OSCE Scholarship for Peace and Security. I hope you have all found this webinar to be informative and inspiring, and I wish you the very best of luck with the scholarship and with your future endeavors in the field of international peace and security. Thank you all very much for your participation.